Who's it going to be? Dontayvion Wicks, Christian Watson, Jayden Reed, Romeo Doubs. Led by Matt LaFleur, Jordan Love came out balling in his first year as the full-time starter for the Green Bay Packers, yet everybody is telling you to stay away from this situation. Stay away from the Packers wide receiver room. We don't know which wide receiver Love is going to target. Everything looks the same. All the target shares look the same. I'm here to tell y'all, hell no. That ain't what you want to do. When you got a quarterback like Jordan Love, who is ascending 4,100 yards last year, top 7 in the NFL, 32 touchdowns, second in the league, top 10 in QBR, you don't want to fade this situation. And I believe that with some of the data that we have, shout out to TruMedia, who I'm getting all this from, and the tool that we've created at Destination Debbie, the Trinity Tracker, which ultimately and essentially is just weighing opportunity and usage rate for the wide receiver position, irregardless of what the quarterback is doing. Those things will be able to help us identify which wide receivers we want to make bets on. And the beautiful thing about Trinity, y'all, is it's predictive. Everybody wants to know what tool will help solve the answers in fantasy football next year or this upcoming season. We got that. Trinity Score, layered over fantasy success over the last 5 years, is hitting at a 60% clip. If you're telling me right now I can get 60% odds in the market, 60% odds when I'm placing a bet, I'm taking that. So this is tried, it's true, it's proven, and the best thing about it, y'all, we are going to talk some high and low end comps for these Green Bay Packers wide receivers using that tool. I'm excited. Opportunity, utilization, the Green Bay Packers wide receivers. You got to trust that Trinity. Let's talk ball.
Okay, let's get it. Bitch, let's get it. Woo!
We're talking about the wide receiver position. We have to start out looking at what the hell is going on in the NFL and where wide receivers are scoring all of their points. So I want to start off quickly by talking about the top 4 routes that are deployed by the NFL teams. They're scoring the most fantasy points. So this is fantasy points by route per team in the NFL. The top 4, number 1 is the hitch route. Teams are scoring 5.7 fantasy points per game from the wide receiver position on the hitch route. Number 2, the go route, screaming straight down the field. 5.56 fantasy points per game by the NFL teams on the go route. Number 3, the out route, 5.36 fantasy points per game on out routes and 4.7 fantasy points per game by team on the crossing route. So those are the 4 most deployed routes by NFL teams and what they're actually scoring fantasy-wise. Now let's take a look at what the wide receivers individually are doing on those 4 routes across the NFL board. With a minimum of 50 targets over the past 5 years, here go the top 4 deployed routes for individual wide receivers in scoring fantasy points. Number 1, the hitch route. On average, with wide receivers that have gained over 40 targets, hitch route is yielding 1.34 fantasy points per target. The go route, 1.30. The out route, 1.27. The crossing route coming in fourth at 1.08 points per game on those targeted routes. Now, you've got some dope receivers that are smashing those averages, but across the board, those are the routes that are scoring the fantasy points. So you've got a historical view. Last 5 years, there's about 4 routes that you want your wide receivers running and being targeted on because they're scoring more points than others. And we know that even in last season, those 4 routes still held true as the primary routes that were being deployed by the wide receivers and they were getting targeted on. Let's talk about Green Bay and what they did on those 4 routes. On the out route, 20.4% of the time the wide receiver was being targeted on the out route. Number 1 on out route targets for the wide receiver position in the NFL. Hitch route, 15% of the time from Green Bay, which was 13th in the league. The go route, 14% of the time the wide receivers were running that, which was 5th in the NFL. And the crossing route, 9% of the time, which was 3rd in the NFL. The fantasy points per game for the Green Bay Packers on those route types. Number 1, the out route, 7.92 points per game. They led the league in running that route. Number 1 in the league in fantasy points per game for the wide receiver when they're targeted on the out route. Go route came in number 2 with 6.89 points per game. That was 5th in the NFL. Crossing route, 6.2 fantasy points per game, which was 3rd in the NFL. And the hitch route, 6.1 fantasy points per game, which was 13th in the NFL. On those 4 routes, the Green Bay Packers finished number 1 at the wide receiver position in fantasy scoring per game with 26.78 points per game, and they were also number 1 in red zone wide receiver targets on those 4 routes with 37. Over the last 5 years under Matt LaFleur, the Green Bay Packers are 8th in wide receiver scoring per game with 23.71 points per game on those 4 routes when the wide receiver is targeted. And on those 4 routes, the wide receiver is playing out wide 54% of the time and in the slot 45% of the time. I maintain that no 2 yards are created equal. Every team creates different environments for players to have success. And when you look at the Green Bay Packers and where they align their wide receivers, tells a very, very important story. So on those 4 routes, over the last 5 years, the Green Bay Packers are 3rd in the NFL at targeting the slot on those 4 routes. The only 2 teams that target the slot position higher on those 4 individual routes are the Los Angeles Rams and the San Francisco 49ers. Now let's dive into the wide receivers on Green Bay and talk about how they fared in those 4 routes and the points per game that they put up when they were deployed and targeted on those routes in 2023. Go route, Jayden Reed, number 1 in scoring for the Green Bay Packers, 3.14 points per game. Jayden Reed was a baller out there when they asked him to run the go route, and he was doing it primarily from the slot. So Jayden Reed leading the way with the go route. The out route, which the Green Bay Packers run more than anybody else in the NFL, 20.4% of the time. Christian Watson led them in scoring, 2.19 points per game. But the difference between Watson, Doubs, and Reed, literally 2.19 to 2.11 points per game. They were the only 3 wide receivers on the Packers to average over 2 points per game when targeted on the out route. Dontayvion Wicks, low man on the totem pole, 1.35 points per game. Not really his forte. Let's move to the crossing route where Jayden Reed once again leads the way, scoring 2.39 points per game when targeted on the crossing route. Now, Bo Melton technically is the leader with 3.28 points per game, but he only had 3 targets, so we throw him out of the subset. Jayden Reed had 14 targets. Wicks was the next closest with 8 crossing route targets. Jayden Reed is the guy that you want, and he's doing it all from the slot. Now, we talk about the hitch route. This was the number 1 scoring route across the NFL for teams over the last 5 years, 5.7 points per game on hitch route targets. For the Green Bay Packers, Bo Melton, again, led the way. He only had 8 targets, so we throw him out of the subset. But Romeo Doubs led the way with 1.55 points per game. Christian Watson, 1.41 points per game. And Jayden Reed, low man on the totem pole, 0.81 fantasy points per game on the hitch route. So when you look at the 4 most deployed routes across the NFL over the last 5 years, what Green Bay has done over the last 5 years, go, hitch, out, crossing route, those things yield the most points. And the player that is doing that stuff on the Green Bay Packers, Jayden Reed, Jayden Reed, Jayden Reed. Now let's take a look at what that totals up to be and where that puts Jayden Reed at historically. When you're just focused on those 4 routes, here's how the points per game total shaped up for the Green Bay Packers wide receiver core. Number 1, Jayden Reed, 8.45 fantasy points per game on those 4 targeted routes, followed by Christian Watson, 7.28 points per game. Romeo Doubs scored 6.54 per game, and Dontayvion Wicks, 4.39 fantasy points per game on those 4 routes. Jayden Reed led the way in targets with 62, Romeo Doubs 53, Christian Watson 38, and Dontayvion Wicks 36. A couple of other interesting data points that I really pay attention to is first down and touchdowns per target. This is an important metric, and the leader in this category, limited volume, limited opportunity, but this is what gives you enthusiasm and hope for Dontayvion Wicks. 50% of his receptions went for first downs or touchdowns. Romeo Doubs, 49%. Jayden Reed, 40%. Christian Watson, 36.8%. Now remember, where these players line up, whether that's in the slot or out wide, makes a big difference for the type of opportunity they get from quarterback Jordan Love. And on these 4 routes, nobody dominated the slot like Jayden Reed. 49 targets from the slot on those 4 routes. Christian Watson was second with 16, Dontayvion Wicks 12, and Romeo Doubs low man with 10. Out wide, Doubs reigned supreme with 43 targets out wide. Dontayvion Wicks second with 24, Christian Watson 21, Jayden Reed 13. Last 5 years under Matt LaFleur, Jayden Reed's 8.45 points per game is fourth only behind Davante Adams in 2019, 2020, and 2021. So you have all this information about what routes wide receivers are running that are scoring them fantasy points, what the wide receivers on Green Bay are doing in the slot out wide and from a route participation standpoint. So we've got to talk about Jordan Love, the quarterback. Are these routes that he's actually proficient in throwing? Well, in 2023, he was tied with Jalen Hurts for the most touchdowns on hitch, out, and go routes with 15. He was third in the NFL, tied for third in the NFL with 277 pass attempts to those routes. He was first in the NFL with 114 first downs when targeting the hitch, out, and go route, and he dropped 2,180 yards, which was fourth in the NFL on those routes. There's no doubt about it. Romeo Doubs is out there running wind sprints. He led the team in routes run, 212. Jayden Reed, 172. Dontayvion Wicks, 122. And Christian Watson, 106. That's how the route participation shaped up in Green Bay. Those are how the routes shaped out in the NFL in Green Bay. Let's go to the Trinity tracker and show you how this actually applies on the field, fantasy scoring, and let's talk about what happened in those games and outcome bets that we need to make in 2024. Now we've got the Trinity tool pulled up, and I'm going to walk you through how to use this. We filter this only to look at Green Bay Packers wide receivers. I think this is more important than looking at the whole group and cluster of wide receivers across the NFL, which we'll do here shortly. But looking at the Packers week 1 through 17, this is what they were asked to do. And what I call it is the wide receiver fantasy scoring shit they were asked to do. Christian Watson led the way with a 6.55 Trinity score, scored 11.3 fantasy points per game. You see Jayden Reed scored more than him, but wasn't asked to do as much wide receiver stuff. 6.44 Trinity score, 13.5 points per game. Romeo Doubs came in third, 5.45. Dontayvion Wicks, 5.27. And Malik Heath way down there at 1.15 fantasy points per game. Now, this is weeks 1 through 17. Quickly, I want to show you some different subsets of what was happening in Green Bay. And we're going to filter this thing to start the season, weeks 1 through 3, in which Christian Watson didn't play. When Christian Watson wasn't on the field, this is how it looked weeks 1 through 3 for the Packers. Jayden Reed led the way, 7.76 Trinity score the first 3 weeks. Pretty damn good, below the trend line, so he should have been scoring a little bit more based on what he was doing, but he was doing enough wide receiver stuff to put him in a very good range. Romeo Doubs was second, 6.89, scoring you 14 points a game. He started off the season hot. There goes Wicks, Toure, and Malik Heath a little bit later down the line. Now let's add Christian Watson back to the fold and see what happens with the wide receiver opportunities and utilization from Matt LaFleur. When Watson was back, you see what happens. He immediately jumped back to the front of the pecking order, being asked to do more wide receiver stuff through weeks 4 through 13 of the NFL season. He was scoring about 11 fantasy points per game. Reed took a significant step back, dropped all the way down below 5, 4.3. Dontayvion Wicks suffered as well. This might have been the stretch where Jordan Love was still trying to figure it out. The final grouping that we're going to move to is the end of the season and see how these guys were playing as we wrapped up the final month of the season. And here it is, weeks 14 through 17 of the NFL season. Jayden Reed skyrocketed to an 8.36 Trinity score, giving us 21.5 points per game. You got Bo Melton hitting the board with a 7.7. Dontayvion Wicks, 7.28, 10 points per game. Dobbs fell back, and no Christian Watson because he was not playing, and this only accounts for the activity when the player is participating on the field. So what does all of this mean? The best part of the Trinity tracker is the historical data tab, because that is where all of these numbers become predictive. You got to remember these numbers here on the front end, and I've got them written down for us: 6.5, 6.44, and this was weeks 1 through 17 of the 2023 season. That's the fantasy season. Now the beauty takes place when we switch over to the historical data tab. Now that we've got this tab pulled up, what you're seeing are different wide receiver plots over the course of the last 5 years. And how this works is what we must do is go get that 6.5 number. Let's find a 6.55. Let's find somebody that was very close to Christian Watson. You've got some 6.6s. There's a 6.55 for Christian Watson. So on the high end, at a 6.55 Trinity score, Christian Watson's point per game total should be roughly around 15.5 points per game on a high end, which is away from the trend line. If we slide down a little bit, You've got a 6.57 from Brandon Ayuk. The following year, 13.4 fantasy points per game. If we go some lower end comps for Christian Watson and his potential range of outcome next year, you also have, who's this right here? DJ Chark, 6.6 and an 8.6 in the following season. You've got Darius Slayton. He had a 6.6 Trinity score in 2022, scored 9 fantasy points per game in the following season. And if you go real low, real low down here, you've got, who's this? Rest in power, Demaryius Thomas. You've got Nelson Aguilar, 6'9". That's a little too high. Got Taylor Gabriel at a 6'4", and we'll talk about TG when we get to when we get to Jayden Reed. So that is how you take the data from the point per game tab right here, go over to the historical data tab, and then you can go high-end range outcomes or low-end range outcomes. And remember, at a 60% clip, this is predictive of what fantasy scoring is going to look like in the following season. So Jayden Reed, 6.44 Trinity score, scored us 13 points per game. Let's look at some high-end range comps for Jayden Reed's potential outcome next season. Calvin Ridley, 6.44, exact same score as Jayden Reed in 2019. Following season in 2020, he put up 18.8 fantasy points per game. Chris Godwin, right there with Jayden Reed, 6.38 Trinity score in 2018. He dropped 19.7 points per game in 2019. And then you've got, who's this right here? There's another Godwin, 6.5 to 17.3. Let's go some medium range comps for Jayden Reed. Got another Godwin, 6.53. Following season, 12.3 fantasy points per game. You also have, who is this? Deontay Johnson, 6.4 Trinity score in 2019. He scored 20 points per game in the following season. And a low-end comp for Jayden Reed, you've got, where is he at? Taylor Gabriel, 6.42 Trinity score in 2018, dropped 9 fantasy points per game in 2019. Romeo Doubs, 5.4 Trinity score. This is not good. You don't want to be sub 5.5, but 5.4 Trinity score for Romeo Doubs. That puts him in Cole Beasley category in 2018. He had a 5.49. He scored 12.3 fantasy points per game the following season. If we go some higher end comps for Romeo Doubs, Mike Williams scored the exact same thing Trinity-wise, 5.45 in 2020, dropped 15 points per game the following season. So there's a high-end comp, Mike Williams, for Romeo Doubs. And let's move on to everybody's favorite wide receiver, Dontayvion Wicks, who scored a 5.27 Trinity score in 2023, which puts him right in range and right in line with George Pickens and what he did in 2022. 5.26 Trinity the following season this year, 12.3 fantasy points per game. If we go high-end range, got Curtis Samuel in 2019, 5.17 to 14.1 fantasy points per game. When you're using this tab, the further away you get from this line, probably the less sticky it is. You've got some outlier seasons. Deebo Samuel of 5.6. Following season, he smashed 21 points per game. Cooper Kupp up here. But look at the predictability. Devontae Adams in those seasons we talked about right there, 9.3 Trinity. Another Devontae Adams, where you at? I know you're all up there. There's a 9.7 Trinity, 9.6 Trinity, 9.5 Trinity for Devontae Adams, and a 9.4. This tool is incredible. So if you're talking high-end range comps for Jayden Reed, you got some 2019 Calvin Ridley vibes. Christian Watson, got some DJ Moore 2019 Christian Watson vibes potentially from the Green Bay Packers. Romeo Doubs, Mike Williams, and Dontayvion Wicks, we're hoping he can be a part of what George Pickens was this year for us. So if you're asking me which wide receiver I want to place my cards and my chips and my bets on from the Green Bay Packers, there's no doubt in my mind it's Jayden Reed. I'd prioritize him, Jayden Reed, Christian Watson, followed by Dontayvion Wicks, then Romeo Doubs. And that is not based on bias. That is not based on sentiment. It's based on the data. I trust the Trinity and the data provided by TruMedia. It's ironclad, baby. Out route, hitch route, go route, crossing route, Jayden Reed, 8.45 fantasy points per game, puts him in very good company across the NFL. Appreciate y'all tapping into this one as we try to decode and decipher this Green Bay Packers wide receiver room using some different tools and techniques opposed to just some of the basic stuff that's been out there and your personal opinion on which player is better or not. So if you appreciated the information in this video, if you want to dive in deeper, comment below, hit the thumbs up button, like the content, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, baby, I don't know what it is. Trust the Trinity. I'm out. Peace.